didn't believe in that, and I was thinking it was like a kind of levitating the energy of the temple. So it's most symbolizing the whole spiritual feeling inside the temple, okay?
What does conventional Egyptology suggest that that's representing?
Well, they are saying that it's stretching a cord around the temple, okay? And it comes just after pouring the water and also putting the foundations offerings. But we can notice that the temple here is complete.
So who were they?
We can't be sure, but if we look at the Temple of Edfu, for example, when we were cruising down the Nile, Ross, we can see these obsessive compulsive depictions of very tall, large beings or netters coming across to Egypt in boats. Boats obviously were used on the high seas and on the Nile, but why so big? Why so many beings inside them? Why depicting the transition from west to east? And is this speaking of an Atlantean type civilization?
So you're talking here about the lost city of Atlantis, which we're told is mythology. It's not true. It's just a story.
For sure, but there are other myths as well of different island, let's say, civilizations all around the world. Look at Mauritius, where I'm from, for example. We say that we hear about this civilization of Lemuria. Lemuria is a Malgache, a Madagascan word. It means souls of the departed. So we can locate this through the etymological, analysis of the language. We also know that there's been studies of island groups around Mauritius or submerged islands, and they would have been above the water's level at one point in time. So, there is evidence for island-type conglomerate areas on the Earth that are a bit different. The gravitational waves are a bit different around this part of the world, and the Earth's crust is much thicker than the average location.
So let's go through some of the specifics that we've seen during our trip. I think very early on, walking through the museum in Cairo, you see these gorgeous statues made out of carved diorite granite, a beautiful, deep, black, polished granite. And I don't know how a civilization that at best only had copper tools or bronze tools, and very early on only had stone tools, how could you possibly make a statue that beautiful with that kind of technology?
You simply can't, and granite or rose granite and diorite are harder than steel on the relevant scale. So we know that they couldn't do it with copper tools to that degree and to
So what explanation is given by conventional Egyptology to explain this?
It is the use of these tools. I mean, that's as far as I can tell, and just hewing and using of the use of rocks to smash.
But that's nonsense.
It is nonsense. It sort of flies in the face of common sense. And the best example of this, Ross, as you'll recall, is probably the unfinished obelisk of Aswan.
So here's one of the biggest mysteries of all, what's called the unfinished obelisk in Aswan in southern Egypt. It's the quarry where all the red granite that was found further north came from. We don't know how they got that granite up the Nile River, and we sure as hell don't know how they moved objects as large as this one. Have a look at this. This is the unfinished obelisk. It's absolutely massive, carved out of one lump of granite. It's absolutely gigantic. It still sits embedded in the granite bedrock, and it's enormous. The cuts are almost 90 degrees accurate, and when you look very closely, like look here, you can see what look like scoop marks in the granite. Now nobody can really explain where those scoop marks came from. They're sure as hell not explained by men with stone adzes. It's a mystery that nobody has ever been able to solve. So JP, I see a gigantic lump of granite, an almost incomprehensibly large lump of granite. It must be hundreds and hundreds of tons.
Yep, it's a mystery that something so large can be shaped, sculpted, and effectively excavated from this rose granite, which is harder than steel. And the only evidence that we're being given is that hard rocks were used over hundreds of years.
I think that's hilarious.
It is funny.
Of using hard rocks to chip away something as accurate as this unfinished obelisk.
Yeah, I think this is beyond 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think advanced tooling was used. My speculation would be sonic tools that could effectively resonate the granite at such a high frequency that it would probably been disintegrated into dust, and it being lead, which could explain why you see these kind of ice cream scoop marks, which are so smooth and perfect. And of course, then the problem is, imagine that this obelisk was actually extracted and it was perfectly cut underneath, there were no breakages and so on, although we see a crack at the top, and that's the explanation given as to why the project failed and was left as it is. But then how do you erect this thing? How do you transport it without it being damaged or broken? What kind of manpower and transport would have been used?
Well, I think our guide's explanation was more plausible, that crack in the rock is actually an attempt by dynastic Egypt to cut a slab out of the granite.
That's right. It's too...
Make smaller ones out of the big one.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a complete...
The drill holes are like at this angle that might make a triangle, like a pointed top.
Have you noticed all the punch marks, the regular punch marks everywhere in the stone? That also seems to have been part of the technique.
This is to lower the level, so you sort of have a step level down to the main event.
I guess the other question is, how on earth would they have lifted something as large as this out of this quarry and transported it up the river to wherever they wanted to move it?
Exactly, and when you think about it, the depictions in Edfu Temple on the Nile, in Komombo, and indeed even in Dendara Temple, the Temple of Hathor, where we see this these beings, these kings, effectively using some kind of energy lines that lift or raise the temple. In one image, you can see the temple is affixed to the ground. In the next image, you see a field around the temple, and it's depicted as being lifted from the ground.
So you think they had levitation?
It would make sense. The only question is how. Where you go into the museum, you're shown an interesting video by the former Antiquities Minister, Dr. Zahi Hawass, and the suggestion is made that these smaller rocks were physically smashed, almost like something out of the beginning of 2001: Space Odyssey, and that's how they extracted or hewed the rose granite from the quarry, creating these perfectly smooth, like scoop marks where the material was extracted from.
That's the thing, when you and I were clambering down underneath that gigantic unfinished obelisk, not only is it, frankly, it's a huge object. I don't know how, even if they had been able to cut it, a civilization that ancient would have been able to lift what was probably, 1,500, 2,000 tons in weight. I mean, you'd need cranes, you'd need machinery, you'd need something to lift it out, wouldn't you?